Good day. We're going to talk today about women in Pentecostalism. I'm here today with Dr. Kimberly Alexander. She's the Associate Professor of the History of Christianity at Regent School of Divinity in Virginia Beach. I'll mention some of your works as we go through our discussion. And I'm Dr. Andrew Gabriel from Horizon College and Seminary and andrewkgabriel.com. So to start our discussion, what are some of the ways that Pentecostals have tended to view women in ministry?
Okay, that's a great question. Interestingly, it's kind of a mixed bag. There seemed to be, for the most part, a general consensus, especially early on and today. And I think this is probably even true globally, though I'm always very cautious to speak for all of Pentecostalism because globally there's a lot of different interpretations of things. But there's a general consensus that women can speak prophetically. The Spirit is poured out, women, daughters prophesy. And that even includes, and most often includes, preaching. So, should women preach has generally not been a problem for Pentecostals. But the issues have been whether they can hold office. Can they pastor? Can they be elders? Obviously, the big issue, can they be at the level of bishop? And that is still an issue in many of the Pentecostal bodies. And that is an issue even around the world. And so, again, a mixed bag. Women can evangelize and have. Women can plant churches, and we're finding now in the research that there are women who planted scores of churches. I have a student working on Egyptian Pentecostal history, and he has found that women were major church planters in Egypt. So, there's one woman who planted, say, 32 churches in Egypt, in like the 1920s and 30s.
Fantastic.
But then often, that once that church was planted, it would be, a male minister would be appointed. So, preaching, exhorting, prophesying, even evangelizing, and missionary service, but not necessarily offices like pastor, elder, and bishop.
So, you co-authored a book called What Women Want, Pentecostal Women. Pentecostal women ministers speak for themselves. So just give us a bit of a summary. What do Pentecostal women want?
Well, that book was written because Estrelda Alexander, another Pentecostal scholar, actually asked, has anyone actually ever asked women what they want? Because the discussions about women in leadership tend to be at the executive levels in denominations, which is dominated by men. So it's kind of men speaking for the women or against the women. So this was an empirical study of women in the Church of God. And I think it also has been verified in some other similar studies that have been done in even places like Scandinavia, French-speaking countries in the world. So there's various other research that sort of corroborates our findings.
And was your study based on America? Or?
Yes, ours was Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee, women with credentials in the United States.
So what did they say?
So surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, disappointingly, one of the main things is that many of them wanted when they were trying to discern the call, a pastor who would even pray with them about it, which is sort of the initial part of that process in most denominations, and it very much is the process in the Church of God. They want to be heard. They want to be valued. They want mentoring. I've
heard that a lot.
Yes.
It's difficult to find a mentor.
It's very difficult to find a mentor. And many of them have found mentors, but outside of the denomination. And there's one woman, and I think she's quoted in the book, she said, "I have longed to be mentored." which is a very sad thing for a woman in ministry to be saying. And many of these women were older and had been in ministry for many years.
Were there some other key themes that came out as well?
Yes. They want to be recognized at a level that they see their brothers being recognized. So they are not asked to preach at often at anything but women's meetings, for instance. They're not asked to preach at regional conventions or those kinds of things. There's often confusion for that they receive, are in. So they go to a meeting and the assumption is they're a pastor's wife. And they're pointed in the direction of the pastor's wife's seminarizers or whatever. And so the kind of over time toll that takes on women really came out. Some of the really sad findings was, that women are in danger of being in what some psychologists would probably call a state of languishment. They are not flourishing because they don't have the support that they need. Their calls are not validated. Sad stories like a woman saying after she got her credentials, her pastor announced it, but said, this really doesn't change anything. She's still just sister, whatever,
Okay, right.
So lack of validation for the call and the work that they're doing. One of the surprising findings is that majority of these women, as I've already mentioned, are church planters, and this was true in the Church of God. But if you look at church planting seminars in most denominations, they don't have women as the speakers.
Yes, very true.
But many of them have planted churches, so there's this untapped resource, that we could use. They're not appointed to larger churches; they just stay long term because they aren't given other opportunities. Those are the kinds of things.
Now, I don't know if this fits into your research for that book, but did you find any really positive stories?
Yes, there were some kind of personal testimonies where people said that they had pastors who really took that seriously and mentored them and affirmed them. I know of one story in particular, when she felt called to plant a church, after she had gone through the whole credentialing process and her pastor had really affirmed all of that, he actually stood up in the congregation and said, Sister Blank is going to be starting a congregation, and it was going to be relatively close by. We will bless any of you who want to go with her and help in that effort. And at that time, their congregation was not that large. But, he has told me that when we did that, there were a couple of families who did go, but it was right after that the Lord sent other families to them to make up the difference.
Right.
That's a rarity, though.
Okay.
That's really a rarity.
Now, I think that should be normal.
Yes. Yeah.
So, you recently co-edited a volume of Numa, which is, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, Numa is the Journal for the Society of Pentecostal Studies. Yeah. And it focused on sexual assault and the Me Too movement as it intersects with Pentecostalism.
Yeah.
So maybe could you summarize a little bit of your findings, maybe some surprises?
Yes, I co-edited it with Linda Ambrose, who's a Canadian scholar. One of the really interesting takeaways of it for me was that Linda and I, and this is a very sad takeaway, we kept having to edit our editorial because the news kept changing and new stories kept emerging.
Like in the current media, right?
Yeah, and in the church world. Because we wanted to situate it, and these horrible stories kept emerging. We finally just had to say, this isn't going to end, so we have to cut this off at some point. I think that's a real statement about the problem, that it's just this never-ending story, and it's an ongoing struggle. One of the things that brought about this whole meeting last year was the fact that there haven't been a lot of Pentecostal leaders who've addressed it. And you hope that will happen before there's an expose in a major newspaper.
Yes, right.
Right?
Like
the
what's
Southern Baptist
happened, exactly,
Church,
right.
or the Roman Catholic Church, obviously.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the situation. One of the really interesting pieces in it is a piece by John Wigger, who is a Methodist scholar, and he's just written a massive book on PTL. And
PTL is
the Jim and Tammy Baker television program that was on in the 80s, and there was this huge scandal involving money, sex, and power, back in the 80s. And so he wrote a massive volume on that. He wrote a piece for us on Jessica Hahn, who was the woman that Jim Baker was involved, young woman that Jim Baker exploited and assaulted, really. She was a young Pentecostal woman who was essentially pimped out by her pastor to Jim Baker. And the point that he makes is nothing was ever done for her after all of that by Pentecostals. So the findings are that we're not talking about this. We tend to deal with them in disciplinary ways. As one of my colleagues in spiritual formation, actually the co-author of the book, James Bowers, once said to our ministers in the Church of God, if you don't do ministerial formation, you will do ministerial discipline. And so it's sort of like that. We do reaction, maybe clean up, unfortunately cover up sometimes. But what are we doing formatively, and why did these problems emerge, and how do we deal with them? Thank you for allowing me to share about that.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander, and thank you everybody for watching.
Yeah.